Good evening, everyone. I'm Elaine Gamble. I am the organizer for Data in the Greater Good, and it's wonderful to see so many of you here this evening. So our focus at Data in the Greater Good is the use of data in mission-driven organizations. Unlike the media, where almost always data is discussed in a very negative context, either breach of data, privacy, the list goes on. When we come here, we talk about the beauty of data and what it offers organizations in the arts, education, social justice, volunteerism, philanthropy. The beauty of data helps them deliver against their mission to make New York better, our country better. All over the world, the beauty of data helps to strengthen communities, helps us to understand communities better and deliver more value and impact. So that is our mission here at Data in the Greater Good. And again, we are delighted to have you here. And we're honored to have Nick Hamlin, data scientist from GlobalGiving, to talk to us about data at GlobalGiving. A little bit about GlobalGiving. It is the first and largest global crowdfunding community that connects donors to nonprofits and organizations in nearly every country. Because of GlobalGiving, over $400 million, nearly 1 million donors have supported more than 25,000 projects all over the world in a variety of areas related to health, education, economic empowerment, among other areas. And the beauty of data is a key enabler of their success and how these donors connect to various communities and how we measure the impact of their success. It has been given the highest rating by Charity Navigator, as well as Candid and others, and recognized for its excellence and innovation in this space. We are honored to have with us tonight Nick Hamlin, who was GlobalGiving's first data scientist. And as their first data scientist, as always is the case when you are first, you wear many hats. And those hats include data strategy, maintaining a data pipeline, various algorithms, measuring the success of GlobalGiving in the countries that they impact. His mission is to make good data accessible and understanding and actionable for everyone at GlobalGiving. In addition, he is the creator of AidSite, an app that explores transparency in data. He is also a data ambassador to DataKind and has conducted research via NSF in China and Thailand. And he's here to talk to us tonight about the beauty of democratized data at GlobalGiving and how it is a true driver of their year-over-year success and making a difference in so many communities all over the world. Please join me in welcoming Nick Hamlin.
Thank you so much for such a generous introduction. It's really a privilege to be here with all of you tonight. Thank you to Elaine and the Data for the Greater Good team for having us. And also for saving me the time to go through my normal intro, where I talk about what GlobalGiving is and who we are and what we do. I'm gonna kind of pass over all of that and get into the hard things, because you've already heard a little bit about how we are on the planet to transform aid and philanthropy and accelerate community-led change. It's a lot of buzzwords. Basically, it boils down to helping the helpers. We help the organizations all around the world doing whatever good looks like in their community, do it better, whether that's through money, information, ideas, networks, training, whatever it is, that's what we want to provide. We were founded in 2002 by two former World Bank executives who had this vision of taking the normal aid and philanthropy paradigm, which at the time, and in many ways still is, a very top-down, prescriptive-driven approach where powerful organizations like the World Bank make multi-million-dollar grants to governments, and kind of taking that model and flipping it on its head, where small, generally grassroots, community-led organizations that identified specific areas where their communities could improve could get access to funding to actually make those changes. This is crowdfunding before crowdfunding was a word. Since 2002, we've raised nearly $500,000 from actually now, we just crossed the $1 million donor mark since I sent Elaine that bio. So I'm happy to get to update this slide. Thank you. From 25,000 projects in basically every country in the world. And one of the things that I love about working at Global Giving is the breadth of the organizations that we partner with. They truly do take every form. If you can imagine a kind of social good, we probably have a partner that does that. Whether that's maternal health in India, whether that's children's agriculture projects in Peru. One of my personal favorites is this organization that's based in Tanzania that trains giant African pouched rats to sniff out landmines in post-conflict areas. They're extremely smart. They're like the size of a house cat. They're really cool. And I would be remiss also if I didn't mention the work of the Disaster Recovery Network at Global Giving, which is a team within Global Giving that focuses specifically on disaster preparedness, recovery, and relief and long-term recovery. And that also takes place all over the world. This shot right here is from a partner in Houston just after Hurricane Harvey. One other thing that I'll mention before I get into the slides here is that all of the imagery that you see, not all, but most of the imagery that you see here is direct, used with permission from our nonprofit partners. Where that's not the case, it will be very obvious. So, I asked when I was talking with Elaine about what I should talk about. She's like, you talk about whatever you want. And so I'm going to talk about data at Global Giving, which is a subject I dearly love and will talk about for hours if you allow me to. So I'm going to impose a constraint on myself and tell a couple stories about how we use data at Global Giving within the restrictions of a metaphor, just to prevent myself from going too far off the rails. And the metaphor starts with this, which is, of course, there's a zillion stories like this floating around talking about the data scientist rock star, Harvard Business School's sexiest job of the 21st century. All of this. I hesitate to call it noise, but there's a certain branding and mystique that has gotten applied to this term data science. And that's not to say that the idea of the data science rock star is necessarily wrong or bad. But here's the metaphor. I will argue tonight that effective data science in the social sector much more closely resembles folk singing as opposed to rock music. Stay with me. There's kind of four areas that I think this analogy starts to make itself known. And that starts with collaboration, simplicity, reinvention, and ultimately winds up at cause. And what I'd like to do is kind of take each one of these four chunks of this analogy and use it to tell a story about some data work that we've done at Global Giving. I will also use this opportunity to talk about some of my favorite folk singers. So this is Pete Seeger. For those who don't recognize him, he is a legend in the folk music world, and he is. I want to start with him because he is a master of facilitating collaboration. There are recordings you can listen to of Pete Seeger teaching the audience how they can sing along, and he does this so deftly. It's very smooth. It's never intimidating. He gives the audience exactly what they need to be part of the music, and doesn't try to give them any more than that. He controls it very well. And what he's able to do is get people engaged and singing along and ultimately collaborating with him, the performer, to make this really remarkable music. He also has a great quote about other ways that collaboration manifests in his music, particularly this idea that he's going to write songs, but ultimately, if they're really good songs, he wants people to make up their own verses and make them their own, extend them in ways that he didn't necessarily intend. That's the process of making folk music. And I would argue that concept of collaboration, of remixing, of allowing people who are not necessarily data people into the conversation is a key differentiator of the social sector data scientist as opposed to what I will describe as kind of the more traditional rock star data scientist that you might encounter at a Facebook or a Google. So what does that look like at Global Giving? As Elaine said, I am the first and only data scientist at Global Giving. I'm the only person on staff with the word data in my title. I'm the only person on staff who's focused on that, all hours of the day. We have a staff of roughly 50 to 60 people, depending on who you count. Most of us are based in DC, a handful of folks in the UK, and then several one-offs kind of spread both across the US and around the world. And we would not be able to do what we do if we didn't provide a way for all of those people who wouldn't necessarily identify as data people, which a term I don't really like, but I'm going to use it anyway. We would not be able to do what we do if we couldn't get those people singing along. And so the way this has been an ongoing process. It continues to be an ongoing process. But the way that we have found has been most effective to do that is with tools like this. This is a screenshot of a tool called Metabase. Is people familiar with Metabase? Handful of folks. Metabase is basically an open source version of like a Looker or a Power BI. It's a way of allowing people to ask and answer questions of data. You can certainly write code if that's something you're comfortable with, but you don't have to. And that feature, to be able to go from a question asked by someone, say, on our program team who has an intimate understanding of the challenges that our nonprofit partners face, but maybe not a great understanding of like the data that underlies that, they can go to Metabase and fairly easily, using a GUI here, make a visualization that then they can drill into. We've spent a lot of time building the infrastructure to make this possible. A lot of it is just Python and SQL, roll your own ETL. But then with this, again, open source and critically free, we are a nonprofit, free tool that sits on top of it that allows that level of integration. And I think it's important to note here also that we specifically do not, and I have messed this up plenty of times, try and push too much off onto the rest of staff. If Pete Seeger were to stand in front of an audience and say, okay, we're all now going to sing this song that's 12 verses long, here we go, 1, 2, 3, that would not go well. Instead, he says, you just have to learn these 2 words. And whenever those 2 words come up, sing along. And having that kind of bounded level of involvement makes people feel, okay, 2 words, I can handle that. In the same way, we don't ask people to write any code unless they feel comfortable doing that, they want to learn that. We don't ask people to do any kinds of crazy, complex math. Generally, what I tell people is, if you feel like you need to do math, come and ask me. I'll help you through it. Maybe you do, maybe you don't, we'll talk about it. But this kind of thing, just a chart of, what is this? This is, this is how much money did we raise last year by day? Incidentally, Giving Tuesday is real. Don't let anybody tell you otherwise. This is Giving Tuesday. A lot of these spikes are campaigns we run throughout the year. This little blip here, that's Hurricane Dorian and the work that the Disaster Recovery Network was doing on supporting people impacted by that. So this is a good example of the level of singing along that we encourage all staff, regardless, all the way down from, we don't have interns, but we have fellows, all the way up to the executive team. And it's a constant dance of how much can we give people, how much should we give people, and I would not claim to have gotten it right all the time, certainly not. But this has been a really effective way to facilitate collaboration and ultimately allow us to punch above our weight when it comes to our data resourcing. And people seem to like it. These are some examples. I just screenshotted some Google Docs and Slack chats. This one is my particular favorite. It's not terrible is high praise when it comes to a data tool being offered to. At the time, Holly, it's worth mentioning, Holly was our office manager. And so she was writing queries that were not terrible about major donors and understanding how they were giving, because she was ultimately processing a lot of those donations that were coming in via paper check. So it's really exciting to get to see this kind of greater than the sum of our parts collaboration kind of naturally filtering out of the data infrastructure that we've set up. Our next theme here is simplicity. Anybody know who this is? Awesome. I love telling people about new musicians that I like. This is Rhiannon Giddens. If you hadn't heard of Rhiannon Giddens, she is a singer, she's a banjo player, she's a fiddler. She's phenomenally talented. And she tends to perform a lot of music that at its core is very simple. There's a lot of stuff kind of slavery era field hollers, there's old bluegrass standards, there's Americana music that has been around for, in many cases, hundreds of years. And harmonically, the music itself is not complicated. But she performs it virtuosically. She takes these very simple musical ideas and extends them into extremely compelling performances, and really illustrates how you don't have to be, have a full orchestra with a gazillion instruments to make a huge musical impact. And this can go wrong. Bob Dylan is also, you listen to early Dylan, the Rolling Stones, the Blowin' in the Winds. These are not complicated songs. They're beautifully written, they're poetic, but they're not complicated. And then Dylan went electric. If you're not familiar with this story, after making his bones as an acoustic musician, I think it was like in the 70s, the Newport Folk Festival, Bob Dylan put on an electric guitar and walked out there and played this electric set for the first time, and people hated it. He tried to kind of step a little bit too far away from the simplicity that people were used to, and that extra bells and whistles and electronic component really turned his audience off. Since then, of course, he's figured out his niche and how to fit the electric component into his music in a way that, now he's a Nobel Prize winner. So all that is to say, you can have very simple things, but if you try to overcomplicate them, they can get gnarly. And I think this is also true in the data world. I mean, there's that famous joke about people say they want a machine learning algorithm, they want a deep learning AI thing, and what they actually need is a SQL statement with a group by. It's funny because it's true. So I want to tell you a story about my Newport Folk Festival, where we tried to do a really cool thing and it didn't work at first because it got too fancy. And I'll show you where we landed. So one of the things that's important to know about all the projects on Global Giving is that in order to remain in good standing and publicly visible on the site, projects publish quarterly reports. These are written narratives that come generally straight from the people doing the work. And if you as a donor have signed up to receive them, they get sent straight to your inbox. It's a great way for organizations to stay connected with their supporters. It's a great way for supporters to understand, what are you doing with my money? It's a real strong relationship builder, and it's a useful way for us as an organization to understand what organizations are doing. And so this is a screenshot actually of one from that rat project that I found in my inbox. And okay, so I made a donation 7 years ago. I'm still getting these emails. That's a long time to be following the progress of a really insignificant donation. So these are really cool. They're very powerful, and we get a lot of them. 25,000 projects, 4 times a year, lots of reports. And as I said, our staff isn't big. As the organization has grown, the influx of project reports has grown, and the staff of people that we have that manage these things has remained totally flat. We don't edit these reports when they come out, but we do have people, or at the time, when this story begins, we had people actually read through every one and make sure that there were no issues with, for example, full names of community members being mentioned in a way that could compromise their privacy, or photos being sent out that didn't comply with our photo policy. Basically, just the kind of compliancy things that we need to do to make sure that this email that's automatically going to go out to, in some cases, hundreds of thousands of people is okay to do that. So that's kind of the use case. They were finding it was unsustainable to actually make this happen at the scale that it needed to continue to happen. And so they said, hey, what can we do on the data side to facilitate this? And we said, cool. Natural language processing is fun. There's a lot of stuff we can do with it. And I think this is a pitfall that happens to many data folks, because data, we like to build stuff. We like fun tools. We like to make cool looking charts like this. I get it. We got a little too fancy. So we had this great idea. I read this paper where someone had scraped all of the public domain novels off of Project Gutenberg and had then done rolling window sentiment analysis over the entire length of those novels, and then tried to understand if they aligned with like the Faulknerian literature archetypes of rags to riches, or riches to rags, or the man in a hole story where it starts out happy and gets sad in the middle and then gets happy again at the end. And so we thought, oh, this is one of many things we did. We thought, oh, what can we learn about the narrative arcs of project reports? Like, there's probably some really interesting stories in there. And so we did that. We replicated this approach from this paper, and we made these cool charts, and we started to see, like, yeah, there is a category of project reports that generally start out kind of sad and then get more happy. And there is a class that generally starts out happy, gets sad, and gets happier again at the end. This helped nobody. We were really optimistic that this was going to be a useful thing, but this was an electric guitar at the Newport Folk Festival. What we actually needed was this, and this is the thing that we actually have that is now running in production and continues to run. This is a screenshot of the automatic report reviewer, and so some little chunks of the pipelines that we built to make those pretty charts remain in use. But all they do is just focus on highlighting the aspects of the reports that we need the humans to look at because they are potential issues. So, for example, you can see here, it's flagged in the body of this particular report the name Mickey Mouse. This is a false positive, but this is a potential situation where it's like, oh, that looks like a full name. Are you sure that you want to send that report out? And so ultimately, it's also scanning for profanity, which incidentally is a really interesting natural language algorithm to write. That's all I'm going to say about that. And so coming back to our theme of simplicity here, like, this is not complicated. This omits a lot of the really cool, fun data pipelining we did around natural language processing, but this is what ultimately the team actually needed. And I think to be effective in a data role, particularly as kind of a sole practitioner in an organization, it's really important to keep that focus on the simplicity of what the team actually needs, because ultimately that's where we find a lot of the value. What am I doing on time? 5 minutes. All right, cool. I'm going to go fast because I have two more themes I want to talk about. And the first here is reinvention. These guys are from the Playing for Change band. Playing for Change is an organization, actually a former GlobalGiving partner, that you may have seen their videos on YouTube. They get musicians from all around the world to kind of virtually collaborate and perform together and reinvent both popular music and folk music, and they're phenomenal. Reinvention in our case, and I think in a way that is reflective of what's useful for data scientists in the social sector, we borrow a lot. I mentioned earlier we stole the idea for that story arc thing from a paper. I want to tell a story about reinventing some concepts from the behavioral economics literature. You may be familiar with Robert Cialdini, who wrote this book Influence, or Dan Ariely, who is the guy behind Predictably Irrational. He's also got a great TED Talk. And they've done a lot of work with social proof and understanding kind of the underlying dynamics of what makes people do a thing. And so we were fortunate enough to get to collaborate with Dan Ariely and his colleagues Mike Norton and Lalina Anik on this project a couple years ago, which was looking at how can we encourage more donors to go from a one-time donation to an ongoing recurring monthly donation. That's a complicated, it's a seemingly simple but actually really complex ask. And so we did a lot of experimenting with how can we take what we know from the behavioral economics world and reinvent it into something that actually is useful on the site. And I'm not going to get too deep in the weeds on this, but what their experiment was to, on the checkout page, put a little flag that says, if 75% of people who see this flag donate, or X%, whatever it is, of people who see this flag choose to upgrade to a recurring donation, we'll match everybody's. And that comes direct from the social proof literature of Cialdini and Ariely. And what they found is actually that if you dial that number in right, it had a material increase in the amount of recurring donations that we got people to sign up for. And this is great. Organizations really benefit from recurring donations because they lead to predictable revenue, and then they can actually plan. And for what tend to be relatively small organizations, the security of knowing that you're going to get that $200 this month, next month, and the month after can be really meaningful. And so this is a big win. Here's what it looks like now. And you'll notice the simplicity angle at play here again. This is actually a lot simpler than what came out of that experiment. There's a lot of reasons behind that. One of them is it's a lot easier to maintain. Two is it's a lot easier to explain when people call in and go, what are you talking about? So right now, every new monthly recurring donation, until we run out of money to do so, gets matched, such that you donate in month one. Once it recurs for, I think it's 3 months, then we match. We give you an additional month for free. And this has been a really, really beneficial both improvement for our organizations, and I think a good example of what reinvention can look like to go from the academic literature into an experiment and ultimately into something that now lives on the site. And I'm going to close with cause, and this is I'll end where we started again with Pete Seeger. This is a shot of Seeger's famous banjo, which he used many banjos over his career, but they were all inscribed with the phrase, "This machine surrounds hate and forces it to surrender." And it's a very visual reminder in what is typically a more auditory context of why he's doing what he does. And I think I want to close with this because it's very easy for data people, I've certainly found myself doing this, to get in the weeds, to get in the code, and to write the feature, to make the software, to fix the bugs, to run the experiment. And ultimately, that doesn't really matter if we're not doing it for a purpose. And I think that's kind of the last thing that is more on the folk singer side of things than on the rock star side of things. Just to kind of finish the story on the recurring donation side, one area where we've really been able to plug that recurring donation feature in is in this idea of the Project of the Month Club. This works the way that it sounds like it does, where instead of signing up to make a recurring donation to the same project every month, you make a donation to the Project of the Month Club. We pool all of those recurring donations and send all of them out to a different project every month that's chosen by our program team, based on their understanding of who's really doing great work and who could use this extra boost of cash to get them over the finish line. And so all of that experimenting that we did and feature building and ultimately stuff that went into the checkout now looks like this. This is a shot from last February's Project of the Month Club that went to the Rahul Kotak Foundation. They're based in rural Kenya. And they took that money, which again is like in the grand scheme of things, not a huge amount of money. It's I think it was about $12,000, and they built a library. Like that library was not there, and is there now as a direct result of this experimentation that came out of the behavioral economics literature. And that's where I want to end, just because it's very easy to lose sight of that in the day-to-day work that we all do. And it's super important. It's what gets me excited to come to work every day and crunch numbers and bang my head against the computer screen. So that's all I have. I'll stop here and want to open it up for questions. But before I do that, I'll just mention that I put my contact information up here. I would love to talk to you more, even if I don't get to talk to you tonight. Please reach out. I made you all a mixtape. That's a short link to a Spotify playlist of all of the music that I mentioned in this presentation, as well as a bunch that I didn't, but music also that echoes those 4 components of collaboration, simplicity, reinvention, and cause. So I hope you give it a listen. I hope you really like it. Thank you all for having me.
Thanks so much for inspiring us. Questions? Any questions from the audience?
Good evening. I work for a nonprofit in the city, and I do their digital content through social media. And one of the things that I have found is that with the new social involvement of like social justice issues, etc., and also the generational changes of like millennials, baby boomers, and Generation X and Y and Z, are you managing, or how are you seeing a trend in probably a questionnaire of like, hey, we're gonna send you this questionnaire, and using that data to see matching a project with that person as far as personality, belief system, etc.? Or how is it that you take the approach of having a conversation with a 25-year-old, out of college, and presenting the opportunity to donate or to make an impact beyond their circle, and your general CEO or executive in that aspect as well?
That's a great question. And I was hoping to see if I could find the link quickly, but I'm not going to stand here and futz with that. We have done some of that. And it's an ongoing question of, as you called out, demographics are changing rapidly right now. There's a lot of other forces that impact how people think about philanthropy and how people choose to give. So it's a constant source of experimentation. One thing that we've done, we experimented with about a year or so ago, was what we call our giving goals page, where you could come and say, it was designed to kind of help you plan your philanthropy over the course of the year. So if you say, these are the kinds of causes I care about, this is about how much I feel like budgeting, and then we'll be able to recommend, oh, here's a project you might want to try supporting. Here, can we help you sign up for a recurring donation that will dial you in exactly to hit your goal? There's certainly a good amount of that kind of thing that we can build, but also we've recently started investing more in marketing. We've not historically had a large marketing team at all, and that's changing a little bit now, as there are increasing numbers of ways to reach people. And so they're doing a lot kind of trying to understand, how do different people of different demographics view the Global Giving brand, for example, or different features. One example of that is that we are, to my knowledge, one of the handful of nonprofit crowdfunding platforms that still accepts physical paper checks. And the reason that we do that is because a lot of older people still are more comfortable doing that than entering their information into a computer and hitting donate. We don't collect a lot of data around that, but you can tell based on the checks. A lot of them tend to be older people. So certainly there's a lot there, and I think we're
continuing to chip away at that. I don't know that we'll ever be done because it's going to keep changing.
You said you had a link to that. Is that like a questionnaire or just?
Yeah, there is a link to it, and I'm not going to stand here and fiddle with the computer to find it, but it's
Global, it's within your.
yes, it is. It's GlobalGiving Giving Goals. Other questions?
Hi, I was just interested in the challenges you guys face in evaluating your impact since you help so many different organizations.
Yeah, it's real hard. So that is another one of those like ongoing large existential questions. I'll talk a little bit how we've done it in the past and how we're kind of shifting a little bit moving forward. Maybe 2016, we started on kind of, okay, it's time for GlobalGiving to do our first impact evaluation, like in kind of a holistic sense. What does that look like? We wanted to know, are organizations that are part of the GlobalGiving universe ultimately faring better over time than organizations that aren't? I mean, that's really kind of the core question, and it's a really hard one to answer for exactly the reasons that you alluded to. A lot of the diversity, both geographically and programmatically, of our organizational partners makes it very hard to design any kind of rigorous experiment around that. And so where we went with that was a pilot study that we did in India. We picked India because we have a large presence there, both of partners and of people who we have connections with that are not partners, who could form a pseudo-random control group. And what we found is we used a tool developed by an organization called PACT, their Organizational Performance Index, which is basically just a way of operationalizing how well an organization is doing. And so we looked at organizations that were part of GlobalGiving versus organizations that were not, and we looked at how they changed over time across a set of 8 different areas of focus. And what we found is that the area where we were having the most encouraging initial signs of impact was in the organizations being more responsive to their communities. And so we know we've taken that now and kind of dialed in on that. So a lot of the conversations we're having now is, well, how can we understand kind of at a more detailed, rigorous level what it means to be community-led? And that's a really hard question. If you have ideas about that, please come and talk to me afterwards. I would love to hear them. That's an ongoing project led by our evidence and learning team in partnership with the Global Fund for Community Foundations. So I will hopefully have more to share on that in the future, but it's an ongoing, really fun, really hard, really scary, but really cool challenge.
Yeah, I have a question, Nick.
Yep.
The community-led aspect of what you do and the promise to donors that, you know, for every dollar, it will be someone in that community that is empowered to move ahead with the change, lead the change that their dollars are funding. Based on what you know or the data, are all of your donors equally comfortable with the community-led aspect of GlobalGiving? Or are there some donors that will be more comfortable with someone jet-setting in, like a missionary type approach, to utilize those dollars? Like, to what degree are donors comfortable with the community-led aspect?
That's a great question. I think certainly they are, generally speaking, because we've seen people continue to get excited to donate and sign up for those project reports and stay engaged. But I think a key at the core of that, I hesitate to say skepticism, but maybe just discomfort with the idea of supporting one organization versus another, is the concept of trust. Part of the reason that people gravitate towards the Save the Children's, the Red Crosses, the Mercy Corps, is they've heard of them. They see them in the news, they know who they are, they're like, oh yeah, that's an organization, I've heard of them, like, I can support them. Whereas they may not have heard of, I'll give you an example, Water, Agroforestry, and Nutrition, which is an organization that's run by a couple in outside Manila in the Philippines. They, by virtue of being on GlobalGiving, every organization that's on GlobalGiving has been vetted by our vetting team. So this is not like a GoFundMe situation where anyone can come on and post, I want to make potato salad or whatever that famous GoFundMe was. All of these organizations are registered nonprofits in whatever country they are in. If they're in the US, it's 501c3. If they're somewhere else, it's whatever the 501c3 equivalent thing is. And so by virtue of being part of a platform where trust is at the core, both in terms of the upfront vetting and the ongoing reporting that happens, the field evaluations that we do, we're able to help people become more comfortable with that notion of supporting an organization they maybe haven't heard of. And that's really valuable, particularly in disaster settings. So that organization, WAND is the acronym, they, after Typhoon Haiyan in 2012, many large international disaster relief NGOs came in to kind of meet the immediate need that was left after that storm. And there was a great one. But they came in and they did a bunch of sanitation work. They built rows upon rows of latrines in the community where WAND operates. And when we went to go visit them after this storm, we had our chief program officer at the time was talking to the couple who runs WAND, and they said, well, no one uses these latrines. That these international large NGOs came in and spent a bunch of money to go and build. And she said, well, why? And she said, well, they never asked what kinds of toilets we use here. And so had they taken a community-led approach in that setting and said, hey, what are you comfortable with? What are your traditions? How can we be as supportive of you as possible in this moment of great vulnerability? Ultimately, they would have had much more bang for that philanthropic buck. And so ultimately, there's the trust component, but then there's also the impact component that sits at the core of community-led development. I think that's why it's so important to us.
Any other questions?
So let's imagine that you were working for a for-profit company, like let's say Spotify, which you mentioned. Do you think you could exploit these same psychological principles to advance those causes?
The behavioral economics ones in particular, absolutely. Many organizations do that. I think for us, though, we, whenever we can, like to work with academic researchers because they have access to and expertise of ideas that kind of go beyond our more general approach. And I'm going to go down here to this is where I will plug our open data page. Because we really like collaborating with people who do bring those ideas. And I think there's plenty of, we cannot provide the Facebook level scale of data sets in collaboration settings for those folks, but there is, I think, a lot of interest on the academic side to understand how can we take these ideas that maybe have come from economics or the marketing literature or social psychology or wherever they are, and use those to do more good. So if any of you are academic researchers and are interested in using our open data or possibly pursuing a research collaboration, please come find me.
Hi there. You mentioned that you were one of the first data people at the organization. Could you just speak a little to what led to that appetite of the organization saying we want to work more with data, we want to be accepting of data, and any hurdles you've run into since being there?
Yeah, that's a great question. I was a recovering reliability consulting engineer for a software company before I came to GlobalGiving. I was figuring out how to make systems that kept track of when machines would break. And I didn't really want to do that anymore. So when I first came to GlobalGiving, I was originally working on the operations team, actually not really in a data role, more in understanding on the process side, how can we better disperse funds to all of the geographies we have to get money to, which is a whole separate discussion. And so in doing that, I had essentially the work that I've been doing previously was data work, even though I didn't recognize it as that at the time. And so after I'd been at GlobalGiving about a year, a business intelligence role opened up. We had a business intelligence concern on the operations side previously. And so I stepped into that role, did that for a little while, and then went back to grad school, kind of increasingly waded further and further into the data side. I think, and then about 2.5 years ago, fully stepped into that role. I switched, now I work on the tech team as opposed to the ops side. And I think the biggest hurdle in that is kind of highlighting the value and importance of building that bottom of the data pyramid. Before we had a formal data role on the tech side, if you wanted to get an answer to the kinds of questions that we now use Metabase for, someone had to sit down and write a query against a production database. And just, breaking people out of that mentality was really challenging. It was like, well, why do we need to do all this other stuff? We have data already. We do. It's impossible to use. It's really confusing if you're not deep in the weeds on it, and it's siloed within a handful of folks that are just, tearing their hair out all day. I don't have any left. And so I think that was the biggest hurdle. And now that we've kind of set that hook and gotten people used to that, I think now kind of the next thing is, okay, how do we scale that? What other tools do we need? How can we keep dialed in this balance between the kinds of questions that would be ideal for everybody to be able to answer and systems that we would expect everybody to be able to use versus things that need to get escalated to a specialist or to me or someone else. It's an ongoing task, but I think we've made a lot of progress, and I'm optimistic that we will continue to make more.
Well, Nick will be here for a few moments
Happy to hang around.
If you have additional questions or information you want to share or exchange. Thank you again, and thank you all for coming. And we hope to see you at our next meetup, tentatively planned for March, TBD on the details. I will be in touch with all of you. Thank you.